I move to adjourn.
Okay.
You ruled at our hearing that my motion to adjourn was out of order at that time. I believe it was pending before this committee, and so I moved to adjourn. We lack the time, we lack the documents, and we need witnesses before we can proceed further with this meeting, Mr. Chairman.
I've already taken the action of holding Kavanaugh over. If you would, I would entertain your motion, but I'd also like to, as long as we have a quorum here and that we have
Well,
a
I
lot
believe,
of
Mr. Chairman, with all due respect, that motion was proper before we began business. I asked that,
You didn't have the floor.
well,
I had the floor.
the motion was pending, Mr. Chairman, and I asked for a vote on it
Sure.
to proceed any business before this committee.
Well, just so everybody understands, the reason I wanted to, we've got some people, because of the weather situations in the southeast, that wanted us to get some things done before we, so that's why I wanted to take the motion that I did on Kavanaugh already.
Well, with all due respect, Mr.
that
Chairman,
motion-
my motion was ruled.
That motion is taken. So then,
Mr.
before
Chairman, if I may be heard,
Mr.
I
Chairman,
raised this motion.
Chairman, we need regular order. The
Yeah.
Chairman's got the floor, and only the chairman can recognize members to speak, as I understand.
Now I'm ready to, I had the floor. I did what any one member of this committee can do, hold over the nomination of Kavanaugh. I've done that. I'm ready to recognize Blumenthal.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I made this motion properly at the hearing. I believe I was entitled to a vote then on the motion to adjourn. We have an even more urgent and pressing duty to get those documents and have witnesses after we do the documents that would enable us to evaluate the serious concerns that have been raised as a result of the evasive and seemingly misleading answers given to us at the hearing. A number of my colleagues are going to have specific motions for subpoenas. I will have one myself, but I believe that my motion to adjourn this meeting was proper before we began any business. It was pending, and I made it properly. So, Mr. Chairman, I believe that this nomination is going to be tainted. It will be stained by a badly broken process that has shattered the norms and broken the traditions of this committee.
Okay.
It has been rushed through to judgment in a highly partisan and unfortunately failed way.
I'd like to say something before we put his motion to a vote. We're in executive session, and to be fair, I'll entertain one motion from the other side, but the second motion will be mine, and that motion will be to have a final vote to report out the nomination of Judge Kavanaugh on September the 20th at 1:45. I don't need to make such a motion or the authority to call for a final vote, but this will serve to put everybody on notice. Call the roll on the motion to adjourn.
Mr. Chairman, in light of the timing, I'm going to withdraw that motion so that we can proceed, with.
Okay. Can I proceed then on getting these held over, the ones that I was going to?
Well,
Jonathan Kobes?
If those to be held over will include Judge Kavanaugh's, then I will ask for a vote on my motion to adjourn.
I've already taken all the action that one member of this committee can take. I had the floor. There was a quorum present, and I, as one member of this committee, held over Kavanaugh's nomination. I have that right.
So,
Well,
Mr. Chairman, may I ask a
Senator,
question?
we'll hear from other senators as well.
I'm a little confused by Senator Blumenthal. He moved to adjourn after you took the action to burn the hold on Judge Kavanaugh. And if he wants to adjourn, we've got other important business on the agenda, including some important legislation, the Victims of Child Abuse Act Reauthorization Act of 2018. If he's determined to adjourn, then that means we won't be able to get to that important piece of legislation nor the other nominations on the agenda. But if all we're going to hear is a repetition of the speeches that we heard during the hearing last week, I'm doubtful we're going to be very productive in terms of doing what the committee's business. And so I'm tempted to join him to second his motion to adjourn if all we're going to hear is a repetition of those speeches. I think that would be a shame, given the important legislation that we've got pending and the other nominations, but I'm just about ready to join him in seconding his motion to adjourn.
Well, I'd like to do the business of the committee. We've got about 13 judges, I think, on some, we've got some U.S. attorneys, other people that we could act on. So if it's a desire of this majority not to proceed, we can do that, but I would beg otherwise that we would, even you, Senator, as much as I respect your desire to maybe join him, I would appreciate the fact that we could go on our business.
Well, maybe we
Chairman.
maybe we could vote on his motion to adjourn, and then we could proceed from there. Hopefully, it would
Chairman.
fail, and we could continue.
Does the senator from Texas make a motion to adjourn? I would entertain that motion.
Well, my understanding is the senator from Connecticut has reasserted his motion to adjourn, given the fact that there has been the Kavanaugh nomination has been held over. So I think that's pending. And maybe it'd be appropriate to
if
call
I
for
may
a
be
vote on that
recognized.
motion to adjourn, which I hope will be defeated.
Senator Bloom?
The purpose of the motion to adjourn, very simply, was to make sure that we have the time and information we need, the documents, the facts, the witnesses, in order to proceed on the Kavanaugh nomination. That was the first order of business. I made the motion before we began the business part of this meeting. I understand the chairman may disagree. I disagree with him respectfully. I think this committee has embarked on a badly broken process. I made this point. I'm not going to belabor it, but I made it at the hearing. And the chairman ruled my motion out of order because we were not in executive committee. As you know, I disagreed with your interpretation of the rules, and I thought it would be the first point that would be addressed by this committee before any nominations were held over. If, Mr. Chairman, you will not grant the motion to adjourn prior to holding over the Kavanaugh nomination, the rest of the committee business can proceed, and I would allow it to do so.
Mr. Chairman.
Do you want the reporter to read back what took place? So you know that I had the floor, we had a quorum, I announced, and I also announced that as a member of this committee, I was holding over the Kavanaugh nomination. Are you saying one member of this committee doesn't have the authority to do that? I don't think you can say that, and if you do say that, I think that you're interpreting when you didn't have the floor, and I had the floor, that you'd misinterpret it. You want to go to that trouble? Senator Whitehouse.
Mr. Chairman, I think
I'm sorry.
the parliamentary question was whether Senator Blumenthal's motion to adjourn from the hearing, duly made and seconded at the hearing, should become the first order of business at this executive session by virtue of having been previously made and seconded.
Yeah.
I understand that in effect there has been a ruling from the chair that that is not the proper procedure, and that's where we stand right now. The question whether to debate or overrule that ruling of the chair is before us. But I think that's the question. Did Senator Blumenthal's properly made and seconded motion at the hearing, which was only not granted at the time, not considered at the time, because we weren't in executive session, did that not pend into this executive session so that it was the first order of business before anything else could be taken up? It is a parliamentary question that I think is fair to resolve one way or the other, but I think that is the question.
Senator Kennedy.
Mr. Chairman, is it not the case that one member of this committee can hold over a nomination?
It's been that way ever since I've been on this
And
committee.
is it not the case that you did that?
Yes, I did do it.
And is it not the case that you had the floor?
Yes, I did have.
Then what are we debating, Mr. Chairman?
Well, We're debating whether or not we should proceed with the other business here.
Okay. Do you have to have a motion or approval of this committee to set a final vote on Judge Kavanaugh for next week?
I don't have to have, no.
All you have to
And
do
I
is-
don't want to have. I was just putting people on notice
Okay.
that if we were going to entertain a motion that to adjourn, then I had the next right to offer a motion, and that's the motion I was going to offer.
Okay. But you've put us on notice, have you not?
What?
You've put us on notice, have you not?
Yeah.
And we're going to have the final vote on Judge Kavanaugh when, per your announcement?
Well, it won't be at a specific time. It'll be September 20th.
Okay.
Senator Feinstein.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to support the motion, and I would like to say why. I don't understand the rush to judgment. I really do not. We have just 7% of this man's records on his participation within the White House. Many of us have questions. If this man is successfully nominated, he could become the deciding vote on major legal issues that Americans care deeply about. So I think taking the time and really being able to make the assessments that are needed to be made is really critical and important. You know, I think it was when information was put forward that 99% of Elena Kagan's record was available at the time of her hearings, it was rather debunked and said, well, that's really not comparable, et cetera. But the position that this man goes into on the existing Supreme Court, and probably will be there for decades, is really a question for this side. And you can see the concern over the nomination. So with all of this concern, it seems to me that what we should do is slow down, get the record, give us a chance to go over them, have another discussion, and then proceed. But the feeling here on our side is that there's a march to judgment that isn't necessary and a lack of information on which to make a determination. And in my opening remarks, I was going to discuss this more fully and more precisely, actually going back to Senator Kennedy's time when he had some of the same responses, which were really prevarications and not answering questions as he did with us. So I think it's really important that we have the full set of data. And to make a decision when the Bush White House, you know, torture, Iraq, there were so many things that were brought forward at that time, not to be able to understand his position on these issues. So have you withdrawn your motion?
Mr. Chairman, I would be willing to withdraw my motion,
Okay, your motion is withdrawn.
but I want to state for the record,
Oh,
that that motion is withdrawn only because it is now moot. It was made as a matter of pending business at the start of this meeting. I recognize the reality. The chair has the gavel.
then,
There's no way to seek justice here. I disagree with the chair. I'm here under protest.
I'd like to make a
There is a fundamental unfairness here because my motion should have been the first order of business. The chair, in my view, with all due respect, preempted that right on the part of a committee member to insist on that motion as a first order of business. And I would yield to my colleague from Minnesota.
Wait a minute.
Okay.
I want to put some, we're going to have some order here of how people speak. But to answer your question, you're ignoring the rule that any one member can hold up a nomination. I had the floor, and you are saying your motion should preempt my having the floor when you didn't even have the floor.
My motion was on the floor. It was pending business before this committee. The chair simply preempted that motion.
That
Point of order.
wasn't a business meeting you were in. So from that standpoint, now I get the point you're making about the motion you made at the hearing. You're saying that was pending here? No, it's not.
Mr. Chairman,
Now, here's where, here's where we are.
If that's the ruling of the chair, we have no appeal, Mr. Chairman, so
Okay.
whatever
Well-
the
What,
the
A
technical,
motion that was out of order can't be in order today because we were in a hearing and the motion was
well,
out
that's
of
where
order
we disagree.
because
Mr.
we weren't business. Now, here's what I'd like to
take
do,
one of them,
except for Senator Feinstein wanting to make a motion, that ought to have priority. I was going to call on Leahy, and then I was going to call on Klobuchar, but when Republicans want to talk, I'm going to get a Republican in between, and Durbin in that order, and I see Tillis and anybody.
I want to be recognized for a motion too, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, Senator.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I move for the committee to authorize the issuance of a subpoena for the National Archives for records from Judge Kavanaugh's service as staff secretary in the White House from 2003 to 2006. Mr. Chairman, it's my understanding that only a subset of Judge Kavanaugh's White House counsel records, as I have pointed out, and none of his staff secretary records have been available. And that's why the committee has just 7% of the records. Some have tried to blame Democrats for their failure to obtain Judge Kavanaugh's full record. They claim our request for his staff secretary documents was too broad and would take too much time. They also say they were unwilling to use search terms to expedite that request. That is not true. On July 23rd, I sent a letter offering to work with the chairman's office to come up with search terms to prioritize the staff secretary's requests. That offer was refused. After that, all of the Democratic members of the committee sent a letter to the archives requesting Judge Kavanaugh's full record. Our request mirrored the bipartisan request for Elena Kagan's records. No more, no less. Because that request was not supported by you, Mr. Chairman, the archives refused to produce these documents. I have that letter of refusal. That was a disappointing blow against transparency and against our right as a minority and the public's right for information. There are two issues that the chairman has long championed, and it honestly makes me wonder, what in Judge Kavanaugh's records are Republicans hiding? Last week's hearing was further proof that we need this full record. As I've said, when questioned about his White House work and views, Judge Kavanaugh was evasive and misleading. Often, he was not able to recall exactly what he had worked on or what his specific role might have been. For instance, I asked the judge whether he worked on any issues related to reproductive health care or choice. Instead of asking, he said this, and I quote, "President Bush was a pro-life president, and so his policy was pro-life. And those who worked for him, therefore, had to assist him, of course, in pursuing those policies. Some of those things may have crossed my desk. I cannot remember the specifics," end quote. So we should be able to see this record for ourselves so that we understand exactly what he worked on and the positions that he took. And this is particularly true given Judge Kavanaugh's admission that his 3 years as staff secretary for President Bush were, quote, "the most interesting and in many ways the most instructive," end quote, to him as a judge. At this point, a subpoena for Judge Kavanaugh's staff secretary records, I strongly believe, is necessary and warranted. Providing advice and consent on a Supreme Court nominee is one of our most serious obligations. The stakes, as I've said, are extremely high. He will be in a pivotal seat on a closely divided court. I urge all my colleagues to support this subpoena.
Before I
Mr. Chairman, I second and ask for a vote.
Is that, you're calling for the question?
I
Okay.
second it.
we'll vote, but I want to, the next motion is going to be on September 20th to have a vote on Kavanaugh at 1:45. Call the roll.
Well, could I ask?
Call.
Okay.
No, they called a question. We're going to go with the question.
Mr. Hatch.
No.
Mr. Graham.
No.
Mr. Cornyn.
No.
Mr. Lee. No. Mr. Cruz. No. Mr. Sass. No. Mr. Flake. No. Mr. Crapo. No. Mr. Tillis.
No.
Mr. Kennedy.
No.
Mrs. Feinstein.
Aye.
Mr. Leahy.
Aye.
Mr. Durbin.
Aye.
Mr. Whitehouse.
Aye.
Ms. Klobuchar.
Aye.
Mr. Coons.
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Blumenthal.
Aye.
Ms. Corona.
Aye.
Mr. Booker.
Aye.
Ms. Harris.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman.
No.
Mr. Chairman, the votes are 10 yeas, 11 nays.
Okay, motion defeated. With that vote, I now move to report from the committee the nomination of Brett Kavanaugh to be Associate Justice of the Supreme Court after debate on September the 20th at 1:45 p.m.
Mr. Chairman, can I ask you a question?
Yes.
So you're saying by setting a time for that, you're going to break with the tradition of this committee, tradition, I might say rules also, certainly the tradition in the 40-some-odd years I've been here, to allow all members the amount of time they need to debate. And what you're saying by setting a time certain, you could arrange it very easily that only one person would be allowed to even debate it up to that time. That, I would say, has never been done in, certainly over the last 40 years under either Republican or Democratic.
It was done in 2003 by Chairman Hatch.
That's when he broke the rules on debate, and everybody realized he'd broken the rules. The fact is that you're saying you're going to set a time, and just to use, you may not intend to do this, but you could get the floor when he came in, and you could talk right up to the time of that, and nobody, Republican or Democrat, would be allowed a chance to even speak. Wouldn't it make a lot more sense to set this thing, allow debate, and then if you feel it's going too long, go ahead and break the rules the way Senator Hatch did, but at least allow everybody a chance to speak. Right now, you're setting up a procedure which could easily block members of this committee from being able to speak. Now, so much has been hidden about Judge Kavanaugh already. His records have been hidden, things he's done, the statements he made about the stolen property by the Republican staff member Manny Miranda. So much of that has been hidden. We ought to at least show the American people that in the United States Senate, all voices can be heard.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead, Senator.
Mr. Chairman,
By the way, I want to make clear, Senator Hatch didn't break the rules. He set a precedent. Go ahead, Senator.
Mr. Chairman, I want to make a point of order about your motion. Rule 4 of the committee reads as follows. If there is objection to bring the matter to a vote without further debate, a roll call of the committee shall be taken and debate shall be terminated if the motion to bring the matter to a vote without further debate passes with 11 votes in the affirmative, one of which must be cast by the minority. You are calling for us to end debate on the nomination of Brett Kavanaugh.
Based on the precedent set by Chairman
Well,
Hatch.
the point I'm making is the rules of the committee directly controvert your motion. You need the vote of one member of the, 11 votes and one member of the minority to stop debate on any matter, let alone a nomination for the Supreme Court.
Yeah. The answer to your question is no, we don't, and we've checked with the Senate parliamentarian.
Mr. Chairman,
Are you ready to call the roll?
Mr. Chairman,
Senator Kennedy. Okay, call the roll.
Mr. Hatch.
Aye.
Mr. Graham. Aye. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Lee. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Sass. Mr. Flake. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Kennedy. Mrs. Feinstein.
No.
Mr. Leahy.
No, because I follow the rules.
Mr. Durbin.
No.
Mr. Whitehouse.
No.
Ms. Klobuchar.
no.
Mr. Coons.
No by
No by
proxy.
proxy?
Mr. Blumenthal.
No.
Ms. Corona.
No.
Mr. Booker.
No.
Ms. Harris.
No.
Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, the votes are 11 yeas, 10
Senator
Mr.
Tillis.
Chairman,
Senator
Mr.
Tillis.
Chairman, I'd like to ask if it's within the rules that we hold over all the other nominees on the calendar for today. I should say the nominees except for.
It's
Judge-
in order, we have a quorum, so they will be held over, yes.
Thank you, Mr.
Mr.
Chairman.
Mr. Chairman,
Klobuchar.
Senator Whitehouse and I have a motion that we want to bring up, and we want to move that the committee authorize the issuance of a subpoena to compel the production of documents that have been withheld on the basis of constitutional privilege. This is a different set of documents than what Senator Feinstein referred to. These are the more than 100,000 pages of documents that the White House has declared privileged. Executive privilege has never been used in this way to block the release of presidential records to the Senate during a Supreme Court nomination. It's never happened before. And this has applied to Supreme Court nominees of presidents from both parties. And we think it's outrageous. We're not even given the reason why they were withheld, and we'd like an explanation of that. And we would like a vote. Senator Whitehouse will add to this. We were talking about a lifetime appointment to the highest court. We want to see those documents before we have a vote on this nominee.
What's never been done, I'll call on you in just a minute. What's never been done before in the case of Supreme Court nominees is to bridge the constitutional privilege. Senator Tillis.
Mr. Chair, I just want to be clear, and if necessary, from the committee staff, I can read off the nominees. I was talking about those on the agenda to be held over, which would be Cobes, Bell, Gallagher, McElroy, Nichols, Packold, Rowland, Seeger, and O'Connor. Those are the only ones that I was suggesting be held over according to the agenda.
Okay, Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you, Chairman. The reason that we're making this motion is because of the importance of an assertion of executive privilege in the separation of powers balance between the executive branch and the legislative branch. The process that I understand from previous assertions of executive privilege is that, first of all, there has to be an assertion. I don't think anybody in this committee can name a person who has asserted executive privilege as to these documents. It's a free-floating, anonymous appearance of the privilege, primarily in the form of a stamp saying constitutional privilege across documents that have been redacted until they are blank. So the process of requiring an executive branch official to assert a privilege has not been met. That's a significant thing. It's customary throughout the law that if a privilege is out there, someone needs to assert it. Someone who has the legal capacity to assert it needs to assert it, and that has not been done. Once that is done, the second thing that ordinarily happens is that a privilege log is maintained so that you can go through what is being withheld and why. And the reason that you have that assertion and that log is so that you can actually have a contention over whether or not executive privilege has been properly asserted. In this case, I think that the assertion of executive privilege fails on the merits. They don't even call it executive privilege. They call it something called constitutional privilege. Who the hell knows what that is? That's never been litigated before. There's never been a proper assertion by an executive in authority, and there's no privilege log for us to review. So we've entered into very foggy and dangerous territory with respect to executive privilege. And I think in any other circumstance, this committee would be very concerned about allowing amorphous and anonymous non-assertions of executive privilege to inhibit our business, which is where we are. The only way, Mr. Chairman, that we get to address that question
Good point.
is if there is a subpoena. The subpoena doesn't overrule the assertion of executive privilege. The subpoena brings to life whether or not there's going to be a proper debate about what I view as a plainly improper assertion of executive privilege. So we need this subpoena not just to get access to these documents, but to get the fundamental question of whether or not there has in fact been a valid assertion of executive privilege. That ought to be a baseline question that every single member of this committee can support. We can view how we want, where the executive privilege line should fall, but at least it will begin the process of trying to generate a proper assertion of the privilege, a proper log, and an opportunity for us to have a review of whether or not this so-called constitutional privilege assertion is legitimate. If we do not do this, we have set a damning precedent by which any future executive can, in amorphous and anonymous fashion, simply provide documents to the committee that are stamped constitutional privilege and have all the text removed, and we are then left neutered and unable to respond. That is not a proper balance between the executive and legislative branches, in my view. We should not summarily surrender on this question without these basic questions even being answered. And a subpoena provides us at least the opportunity on a continuing basis to get to the question of whether or not this anonymous assertion of so-called constitutional privilege has any merit at all. If it does, great. If it doesn't, we should know that. But we can't even engage without the subpoena.
And that's why we want the subpoena for the documents, and we also want the subpoena for the log, so we can get an explanation.
Is the log, which we doubt.
I want to address the first-time comment made, because our research shows President Reagan claimed privilege over documents from Chief Justice Rehnquist's service in the Department of Justice. President Bush similarly claimed privilege over documents from Chief Justice Roberts' service in the Office of Solicitor General. The administration's assertion is in line with those precedents. Moreover, presidents haven't had to assert privilege in other nominations because we declined to request highly sensitive documents. In Justice Alito's nomination, for example, the committee didn't receive documents from his service in the Office of Solicitor General and the Office of Legal Counsel, and we declined to demand Justice Kagan's Solicitor General documents. I'm going to call on Senator Tillis.
Mr. Chair.
And then I want to be...
Senator Tillis, Senator Lee, do you still want to speak? Okay. I'll go back and forth, so we'll go, no, it was Kennedy. Was it Tillis? Kennedy.
I move the previous question on Senator Klobuchar's motion.
Well,
Okay.
and I want to correct something the chairman just said, if I could.
Okay.
Chairman?
Mr. Chairman, is my motion in order?
Yeah, his motion is order. Can you withhold for at least two speakers?
Sure, as long as I don't lose my place after.
You won't.
This will be very brief. You mentioned President Reagan invoked executive privilege. What you neglected to mention was that this committee said we can't accept that, and a letter from both
Correct.
Republicans and Democrats in this committee went to President Reagan about it. I recall this very, very well because I was in those discussions. And President Reagan said, oh, okay. You want it? This was on the Rehnquist nomination, and we were given it. I'd also note that one Republican who had voted for Justice Rehnquist in the committee, once he saw the records, he voted against Justice Rehnquist. Justice Rehnquist was confirmed with both Democratic and Republican votes, but the point is that we did not have an executive privilege there because President Reagan, when this committee did what it should do, Republicans and Democrats together saying, you can't assert executive privilege over that. President Reagan said, okay, you're right, and withdrew the request.
Mr. Chairman, can we make our motion to subpoena those documents, the 100,000 documents, as well as if any log exists where they assert the privilege, so we at least know why they're claiming that they can't be released?
Well, first of all, to correct Chairman Leahy, Reagan waived some privilege and others he didn't. You ready for the previous question? Clerk will call the roll.
Would you
What is
state the
it?
question, please?
The question is a subpoena for the constitutional privilege documents.
And any privilege log that.
And any privilege log,
Yeah,
that would be.
and privilege log.
Mr. Hatch. No. Mr. Graham.
No.
Mr. Cornish.
No.
Mr. Lee. No. Mr. Cruz. No. Mr. Sass. No. Mr. Flake. No. Mr. Crapo.
No.
Mr. Tillis.
No.
Mr. Kennedy.
No.
Mrs. Feinstein.
Aye.
Mr. Leahy. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Whitehouse.
Aye.
Ms. Klobuchar.
Aye.
Mr. Coons.
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Blumenthal.
Aye.
Ms. Corona.
Aye.
Mr. Booker.
Yes.
Ms. Harris.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman.
No.
Mr. Chairman, the votes are 10 yeas, 11 nays.
The motion loses. Senator Cornyn.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to add briefly the reasons why I think the committee appropriately voted no on, well, where we find ourselves. This is, as I've observed before, not a court of law, because different rules would apply if we were actually in a contested court case. But where we find ourselves is that now, absent legal compulsion like a subpoena, we rely upon the goodwill of the custodian of the documents, in this case, the George W. Bush Library, to voluntarily provide us the documents subject to our request. In doing so, appropriately, the President Bush in this case, has had a lawyer review the documents like President Clinton did in the Kagan matter when Bruce Lindsay made a similar review, and ask the committee to designate certain documents as committee confidential. As the chairman knows, on specific request, I think Senator Klobuchar being the most prominent one, the committee reviewed those documents when it was able to work through that claim of committee confidentiality and actually allow those documents to be made public. And that's, of course, the right way to handle that. But because our colleagues across the aisle, some of them have decided to disregard those claims of committee confidentiality and not follow the appropriate process and intentionally violated committee confidentiality, that virtually guarantees that in future nominations, we will get less voluntary cooperation from the custodian of those records. And I think that defeats the goal that our friends across the aisle claim to be advocating in favor of, more production, not less. But violating those committee confidentiality will result in less documents being produced. The reason why we don't operate by subpoena, like the senator from Rhode Island and others are advocating, and others across the aisle, is because I don't think the Senate wants to have contested court proceedings that could go on for years while a trial court, appellate court, and the Supreme Court ultimately rule on claims of executive privilege. To see that stop, at least slow down for years, maybe longer, the nominations process. So that's why these decisions are most appropriately made by the chairman in the legislative process, in the nominations process, and that's why I believe it would be a mistake for the committee to issue a subpoena, thus setting up a court case which could go on literally for years before it was finally resolved as to whether claims of privilege were valid or not.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Feinstein said to me she was hoping she could use her opening statement. I'm willing to put my opening statement in the record if you want to go to your statement, and then we'll go to the committee's business.
All right.
If we can.
Mr. Chairman, we have some other motions that relate to the Kavanaugh proceeding, so
Okay.
I'd like
And
us
I
to
also
get to
have a
those
privilege
motions.
motion, Mr. Chairman, when you can give to me.
You have a motion?
Yes, sir.
Okay, we'll take Senator, well, I'll take your motion, but I should call on Senator Durbin first.
You want to go ahead with your opening statement?
Well,
I'd defer to the ranking member's opening statement, and then I'll be...
well, could you defer your opening
I will.
statement? Because I'd like to get these motions out of the way before we do our business.
Mr. Chairman, I'd just like to observe here that every member of this committee has gone back to their home state and told the people, when asked, it is time to restore civility in the United States Senate. It is time for us to try to do things on a bipartisan basis. They're shocked to hear many of us say there are a lot of things going on a bipartisan basis. But what we have witnessed here this morning, sadly, in the Senate Judiciary Committee, is the deterioration of that bipartisanship and respect for the minority in the committee. We've seen this consistently. Dramatic changes to the blue slip process, an announcement that the American Bar Association ratings were no longer necessary to move a nominee forward. We saw it, of course, with the decision not to fill the Scalia vacancy for 400 days and the refusal to even meet with, let alone have a hearing, for President Obama's Supreme Court nominee, Merrick Garland. Now today, I'm afraid we've set another precedent. It may have slipped by you, but I hope you will just reflect for a moment. The committee rules said, and rules that we have followed for decades, that one member of the minority had to be voting in favor of the motion to close debate on a subject. By the earlier vote that was taken, we've eliminated that rule and set a new majority precedent. Once again, stepping on the concept of respecting the right of the minority. We have seen in this Kavanaugh nomination something we've never seen before. I don't know where we came up with this committee confidential standard. It used to be strictly limited to questions that were so sensitive that we took them behind closed doors. And now we've allowed someone named Bill Burke to rewrite the rules of the Senate, if not the Constitution, when it comes to this. Why are we giving away all this authority on this committee? We stepped back for a year and a half now from relevant investigations of this president and allowed other committees of jurisdiction to ignore our responsibility in the Senate Judiciary Committee. We are a whisper, a shell of what this committee once was. It used to be the guiding committee in the United States Senate, maybe the most prestigious in my estimation, when it came to serious issues about constitutionality and the future of this government. But we seem to be stepping away from it in obviously a hurried state to approve every judicial nominee as quickly as possible, even for the Supreme Court, without the production of documents, without the evidence, without due deliberation. To realize we just voted here this morning that we're going to have a final vote on a nominee come hell, high water, or whatever occurs between now and a week from now. We've said there's nothing that can stop us. We're going to vote. That is irresponsible. Don't we have a responsibility to look at this nominee honestly and to consider all the evidence, that which we've already received and that which may come before us? I think that is what the American people expect of us. But we are stepping back from that time and time and time again. Some of us have served in this committee and been honored to serve on it for decades. This is not the Senate Judiciary Committee, which I was appointed to years ago. It's not the one that Senator Leahy knew, Senator Feinstein, Senator Grassley, or Senator Hatch. It's a different committee. It's a committee that we have created with the changes in rules. If we are truly going to say to our people back home, we're committed to civility and we're committed to bipartisanship, we ought to prove it. We ought to stick by basic rules that give the minority a voice. And I think what we've done this morning, sadly, is a step in the wrong direction. I have a motion for a subpoena, which I'll withhold until the ranking member has made her opening statement.
And Mr. Chairman, if I could just have one,
Go ahead.
literally
Go ahead.
a minute.
Senator Leahy.
Now that the senior senator from Texas is back in the room, I do want to correct something he said about Elena Kagan. We got 99% from a Democratic administration, 99% of her records. That followed a letter from me as chairman and Jeff Sessions as ranking member. We agreed on that. We jointly, Republicans and Democrats, joined together on it. The 1%, we were shown what that was, and we agreed to it. Those are the facts. So we had all the records, considerably more than ever had before. A Democrat was chair of this committee, the Democratic administration. We got all the records the Republicans and Democrats asked for. Similar to Sotomayor, we went back to something in a job she had in the 80s.
Mr. Chairman.
I'll call on you in just a minute. You conveniently leave out every time you say that Kagan's Solicitor General documents, and also in comment to what Senator Durbin said, it sounds like this just recently has happened, that there's controversy over Supreme Court nominees. I would suggest that it at least started with the borking of Bork or the crucifying of Thomas, as an example. And I thought Hatch set a pretty darn good example After we went through the Bork situation, the Thomas situation, Chairman Hatch, well, maybe he wasn't chairman then, but he said, we've got to have a more, careful approach to this whole thing. So he worked with the Clinton administration, and you had Breyer get through 87-9. You had Ginsburg get through 96-3, and then all of a sudden Bush gets elected, and then we run into the same Democratic opposition to people like Estrada for 7 cloture votes that he could not get. Before that, cloture votes were very, very rarely used in judges. Senator Cornyn.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to briefly say, I don't think my friend, the senior senator from Vermont, and I disagree. But the point I was trying to make is that it is appropriate to have the lawyer, in this case, Bruce Lindsay for the Clinton administration, Mr. Burke for the Bush Library, to review the documents to determine whether there is a basis for a claim or privilege. So I don't think you and I disagree on that. What I would point out is that in light of the knowledge of the committee that Elena Kagan, during her time as Solicitor General, would in all likelihood have legitimate claims or privilege by the Clinton White House, they weren't even requested. Here we have a broad request for anything and everything, including privileged documents. That's the reason why we find ourselves in a different posture.
Okay, I have 2 people that wanted to make motions. I'm going to start with Senator Orono, then we're going to go to Senator Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I make my motion, I would like to say with regard to the committee confidential documents, it is not that such documents exist. It is how we get to the point where these documents are designated as committee confidential, and that is the issue. That is the question, that is the difference, the disagreement that we have. I totally disagree with the designation of documents as committee confidential when it is done in a process that was not agreed upon in a bipartisan way. That is my understanding of how these documents were deemed confidential in the past, and why we should have to adhere to a designation by one person, not even in a bipartisan agreement, is totally unfair and in my view, unlike you, Mr. Chairman. Here's my motion. I move that we issue a subpoena for the documents during the period that Judge Kavanaugh was staff secretary related to Native Hawaiian, Alaska Native, and Native American issues. Why is this important? We already know from looking through 190,000 or so committee confidential documents, there was one document that disclosed his view about Native Hawaiians and indigenous peoples. I would like to know what else there may be during the time that he was staff secretary, at a time during the Bush administration when they were confronted with issues relating to Native Hawaiian rights, which, by the way, the Bush administration did not choose to acknowledge. So my motion is very specific. I move that we issue a subpoena for the records relating to Native Hawaiian, Alaska Native, and Native American issues during the time that Judge Kavanaugh was White House staff secretary.
Mr. Chairman,
Senator Kennedy.
I move the previous question on Senator Hirono's motion.
Would you restate your motion, Senator Hirono?
That a subpoena be issued for records related to Native Hawaiian, Alaska Native, and Native American issues during the time that Judge Kavanaugh was White House staff secretary.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hatch.
No.
Mr. Graham.
No.
Mr. Cornyn.
No.
Mr. Lee.
Six
Mr. Cruz.
against Bork.
Mr. Sass.
How many? 6.
Mr. Flake.
No by proxy.
Mr. Crapo. No. Mr. Tillis.
No.
Ms. Klobuchar.
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Coons. Aye. Mr. Blumenthal.
Aye.
Ms. Hirono. Mr. Booker.
Aye.
Ms. Harris.
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Chairman.
No.
Mr. Chairman, the votes are 10 yeas, 11 nays.
Motion defeated. Senator Kennedy, I promise you that you can make a motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I make the motion, may I inquire of the chair what other business you were hoping to accomplish
Well-
today. I'm a little confused in light of the motions to hold some of the nominees over.
Okay. I would hope we could also add the pieces of legislation that haven't been held over yet, and I can't, I don't have it in front of me, but I hope we can hold those over as well.
Mr. Chairman, is a motion in order
Yeah. Let me state,
there's a motion in order to move approval of S 2961,
well,
S 33.
the practice in this committee is to do the nominees before we vote on the legislation.
Which nominees are still on the table, if I might inquire, Mr. Chairman?
Yeah. Is it okay if we go ahead with the business of the committee?
Mr. Chair, I would like to make one more motion.
Okay.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I thought I had the floor
Yeah,
here.
I'm sorry, I thought you were done. You do have the floor. If you say you weren't done, you aren't done, go
That's
proceed.
What I'm trying to find out, Mr. Chairman, is I understand our colleagues want to make motions to subpoena, and that's their right. But if we could get an idea of how many more we're going to have,
Yeah, it looks to me like,
when we're going to get to committee business, because if we're just going to relitigate the confirmation hearing, I'm prepared to make a motion to adjourn.
okay, here's, I'm going to ask, I can't answer your question, so I'm going to ask the other side. I know at least one, Senator Blumenthal. Number two is Senator Durbin. Then can we go to the business of the committee? I get a consensus from that side. We'll take two motions.
That's 2, 3?
No, three motions.
I did mine.
Blumenthal, Coons, and Durbin.
And then we're going to move to committee business?
Yes.
Okay, I'll hold my motion.
Okay, then Senator Blumenthal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And it was to give my colleagues an opportunity to make these motions that I did not move forward with the motion to adjourn and to enable the business of this committee to go forward. And I would like to make a motion to subpoena the following individuals for interviews and then testimony before this committee: Manny Miranda, Jason Lundell, Don Willett, William Pickle. I'm willing to add others if colleagues think that they should be. This testimony is vital in the interviews and in hearings under oath before this committee to resolve key questions of fact that were raised in the hearing and by documents that have been released. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for waiving the committee confidential designation as to those documents. Our colleague, Senator Leahy, very pointedly raised questions that, in my view, leave more questions than answers. And the only way to resolve them, the only way to address these concerns about Judge Kavanaugh's credibility before this committee is to hear from those witnesses. If we do our job, we'll hear from those witnesses. If we fail to hear from them, we are, in effect, failing to do our job.
Okay, the motion's clear. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hatch?
No.
Mr. Graham?
No.
Mr. Cornyn?
No.
Mr. Lee? No. Mr. Cruz? No. Mr. Sass?
No by proxy.
Mr. Flake?
No by proxy.
Mr. Crapo?
No.
Mr. Tillis?
No.
Mr. Kennedy?
No.
Mrs. Feinstein?
Aye.
Mr. Leahy? Mr. Durbin? Mr. Whitehouse?
Aye by proxy.
Ms. Klobuchar?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Coons?
Aye.
Mr. Blumenthal?
Aye.
Ms. Hirono?
Aye.
Mr. Booker?
Yes.
Ms. Harris?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman, the votes are 10 yeas, 11 nays.
The motion's lost to Senator Durbin.
Mr. Chairman, there was a testimony given by this nominee, Brett Kavanaugh, before this committee under oath in 2006, and during the course of his testimony, he made a very declarative sentence saying that he had no involvement in issues involving detention and interrogation. It has turned out, at least in 3 specific instances where we have written documents, that was not true. He was involved in discussions about access to counsel for detainees. He was involved in the Hamdi and Padilla detainee cases, and he was involved with President Bush's signing statement on the McCain torture amendment, though he's refused to tell us the advice he gave on the law. What is it worth for these witnesses to stand before our committee, raise their hand, and take an oath, if they then turn around and say things that are not true to us and are not held accountable? Is there any credibility in this committee? What credibility is there for the witness under the circumstances? This request for subpoenaed documents related to, at the National Archives, related to the rules governing detention of combatants, goes to the heart of why we even administer an oath before the committee. What is the purpose of it? If we are not holding witnesses to telling the truth, and when they fail to tell the truth, not hold them accountable, why do we do it? Why do we waste the time of this committee in doing it? I'm asking for documents to be presented. If they end up clearing Mr. Kavanaugh from what I think were contradictions on the face, so be it. But if they don't, it's a very serious matter for a man seeking a lifetime appointment to the highest court in the land.
I disagree with your point. I'm going to put a statement in the record, and the clerk will call the roll on the Durbin motion.
Mr. Hatch. No. Mr. Graham. No. Mr. Cornyn. No. Mr. Lee. No. Mr. Cruz. No. Mr. Sass.
Oh, no by proxy.
Mr. Flake.
No by proxy.
Mr. Crapo. No. Mr. Tillis.
No.
Mr. Kennedy.
No.
Mrs. Feinstein.
Aye.
Mr. Leahy.
Aye.
Mr. Durbin. Mr. Whitehouse.
Aye by proxy.
Ms. Klobuchar.
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Coons. Aye. Mr. Blumenthal. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Booker.
Aye.
Aye by
Harris.
proxy.
Grassley, no.
Mr. Chairman.
Grassley, no.
Mr. Chairman, the votes are 10 yeas, 11 nays.
Okay, motion lost. Senator Coons.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For reasons I hope my questioning of the witness made clear during the confirmation hearings, I am significantly concerned about his views on presidential power. So I move the committee authorize the issuance of a subpoena to the National Archives for the full record of the nominees' service in a way that might bear on the subject of whether a president can be subject to an investigation or fire a special counsel at will.
Okay, yeah, call the roll, clerk.
Mr. Hatch.
No.
Mr. Graham.
No.
What's this
Mr.
on?
Cornyn. No. Mr. Lee. No. Mr. Cruz. No. Mr. Sass.
No by proxy.
Mr. Flake.
No by proxy.
Mr. Crapo. No. Mr. Tillis.
No.
Mr. Kennedy.
No.
Mrs. Feinstein.
Aye.
Mr. Leahy.
Aye.
Mr. Durbin. Mr. Whitehouse.
Aye by proxy.
Ms. Klobuchar.
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Coons. Mr. Blumenthal. Ms. Hirono.
Yeah.
Mr. Booker.
Yes.
Ms. Harris.
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Chairman.
No.
Mr. Chairman, the votes are 10 yeas, 11 nays.
Would it, the motion lost, would it be possible for us to vote and then we'll stay for your opening statement at the end?
I would like to make one brief comment, and I'll
Go
put my
ahead.
opening
Please
statement in the
do.
record.
Go ahead, make your brief comment.
My comment is that with what you said, Senator,
Yeah, I think it was on and you turned it off.
with what you said, Senator Cornyn, if I may, as I understand it, we did not get the documents from the library, and that's the problem. A lawyer was sent in to select the documents, and I see that as a problem. I mean, documents coming from anybody's archive seems to me, for a purpose like this, should not be selected by a president's lawyer.